At a family dinner, when I told my parents that my twin sister would be one of my bridesmaids, my mom screamed in my face, "If Lila shows up at the wedding, don't call me mom anymore." That sentence hit me like a blade slicing straight into my memory. It didn't just blow up the atmosphere at dinner, it instantly shattered everything I'd ever believed about family. Why would my mother say something so cruel right in front of both me and my sister? Stay with me. I'll tell you everything I went through. Hello, everyone. My name is Lily Chambers. I'm 30 years old, living in Scottsdale, Arizona, and working in cosmetic surgery. Life these days is pretty peaceful with Alex, my fiance, an intelligent, calm man who knows how to truly listen without needing to control everything. He works in healthcare and has a deep understanding of human emotions, and maybe that's why he's the first person in my life to make me feel accepted without having to explain myself too much. We're getting ready to welcome our first child. A baby girl will be born in just a few weeks, the result of years of love and trust we've built together. Both sides of the family are excited about the baby's arrival, but the one who's looking forward to it the most isn't my parents. It's Lila, my twin sister, who's lived with autism spectrum disorder since she was 4, who spent nearly 30 years hidden behind the closed doors of our family, and who's now about to become an aunt. Lila hasn't had the freedom I've had. She lives within boundaries confined by limits that other people decided for her. But of all the things I've ever seen in her, her smile, pure and without agenda, is the one thing I could never turn away from. To protect that look in her eyes, I had to make a choice that almost cost me every blood tie I've ever known, a place I once believed would always be home. My story began just 1 month before my wedding. I remember that dinner like it was yesterday. It seemed like any ordinary evening. Around 6:00 p.m., we gathered at my parents' dining table. Brandon Chambers, my father, a former state senator, never left the table without first checking the evening's political news. My mother, Aurora, who used to run a major charity organization, carried herself like a woman who knew how to command a room with her eyes and silence. There were no guests that night, just me, Alex, Lila, and my parents. Everything felt normal at first. My mom asked a few questions about the dress fitting. My dad recapped who he'd run into at a recent fundraiser. Alex smiled politely, chiming in here and there with a few pleasant remarks. Lila sat next to me, quietly, focused on her food. Now and then, she'd glance over at me and then back down at her plate like she was trying to say, "I'm still here." Once the main course had been cleared, the table slipped into that familiar lull before dessert. Everyone leaned back slightly, the conversation softening, the evening winding down. And in that exact moment, that ordinary peaceful moment, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Right then, I placed my hand on the table, kept my voice steady, looked at my parents, and said clearly, "I want Lila to be a bridesmaid." The moment the words left my mouth, my mother looked up. Her eyes froze briefly, like she wasn't sure she'd heard me right. Her face went pale, and then in a cold, stern voice, she said, "You want to turn your wedding into a pity show?" The air around the table dropped a beat. My father remained seated, hands clasped across his chest. He didn't look at me. He looked past me, straight into the space behind my back, like he was rehearsing a speech he'd already prepared in his head. Then, in a slow, measured tone, he said, "You don't understand. Just one decision like that could unravel everything your mother and I have worked to protect for years." I felt like I'd been cut out of the conversation. No one asked why I wanted Lila beside me. No one asked what it meant to me. All they talked about was what might be lost: image, status, and pride. Next to me, Alex shifted slightly as if he was about to speak up, but I gave a slight shake of my head, and he understood this was something I had to face on my own. In that moment's thick, heavy air, Lila was still beaming. Eyes lit up with genuine joy. She nodded and said as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "Lila stands next. Lily marries." Her words didn't soften the mood. If anything, they stretched the already thin thread even tighter. My mother slammed her hand down on the table. The sharp, decisive sound made the entire room flinch. Glaring at Lila, she spat out each word. "Shut up! No one told you to speak." After that outburst, I turned to Lila. She still wore a smile, but her eyes dropped. Her body curled in just a bit. She didn't ask why my mother was angry. She didn't fight back. She just went quiet, like someone too used to being told to disappear. Seeing that look on her face, I couldn't stay seated another second. I pushed my chair back and stood up, looking straight at my mother. "I said it. each word rising from a place that had been silenced for far too long. Lila is my sister. She didn't answer right away. She leaned back slightly, scanning me, like she was checking whether I just said that. Then, with a sharp, icy tone, she said, "You're challenging me, Lily." I didn't respond. I just stood there in silence. A few seconds later, she spoke again, her voice colder than before. "If Lila shows up at the wedding, don't call me Mom anymore. I won't be there if you put her in front of 300 guests. Your father won't pay for the wedding." As her words hit, a chill ran down my spine. In that moment, I didn't feel like a daughter getting ready to start a new chapter in life. I felt like a flaw in a carefully laid plan my mother had crafted long ago. I hadn't even opened my mouth when my father cut in, his voice sharp, commanding, leaving no space for reply. This time he didn't look away. He looked straight at me. That look wasn't angry. It wasn't harsh. It was disturbingly calm, like I wasn't his daughter anymore, but a political liability that needed to be shut down before it could spread. In a voice lower and heavier than usual, he said, "If you go through with putting Lila up there, then after that night, the name Lily Chambers won't be safe anymore." He paused, then leaned forward just slightly. His voice didn't rise, but every word hit square in my chest. "I'm the one who's kept your clinic from getting picked apart all these years. You think your high-end clients will stick around once they find out their doctor has a sister the whole family's been deliberately avoiding?" As the last word left his mouth, I felt something clamp tight around my chest, like a door had just slammed shut behind me. I didn't say anything. I stood still, but in that moment, one truth became unmistakably clear. They were willing to cut me off fully if I no longer fit the image they'd worked so hard to protect. I turned to Alex. He didn't say a word. He gently squeezed my hand under the table, his eyes locked onto mine, steady and unwavering. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel they were waiting for me to walk it back, like I had before, but not this time. Even with their threats, even knowing what was coming, I would still have Lila stand beside me. Not as an act of defiance, but because this, to me, was what family meant. And in that moment, right in the house I grew up in, I knew I no longer had a place in the picture they were trying to preserve. What had just happened was only the beginning. After dinner, we left the house in silence. Alex walked close beside me, his hand holding mine the entire way home. Not a single word was spoken, but that silence, that quiet, was precisely what I needed. Not to cool down my anger, but to keep everything inside me from breaking apart even more. Streetlights slid by, slowly outside the window as we drove, but in my mind all I could see was Lila, the gentleness in her eyes when Mom screamed at her, the quiet nod no one noticed but me, and that smile that stayed on her face as if the words hadn't hurt her at all, even though I knew they were harsh enough to make anyone else walk away from the table in shame. And just like that, in one brief moment, memories began to return of the years we grew up side by side, sharing every meal, every sigh, every tiny thing in a house where only one of us was ever allowed to exist entirely. I remembered having a high fever and being stuck in bed all day. Lila sat at the foot of my bed, hugging her knees, not saying a word, never moving. Her presence, quiet and constant, like everything about her, made me feel better than any medicine or comforting words ever could. I remembered when Mom scolded me for knocking over a vase in the living room. Lila came out from the kitchen, stood beside me, and whispered an apology. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but maybe she thought it was better to share it if someone had to take the blame. She sometimes drew the two of us on a blank sheet of paper. One was smiling, the other was holding a hand. She didn't say anything when she gave me the drawing, but in that moment I knew I'd never be able to throw it away. And to this day, I still haven't. I don't remember all the toys we had, the birthday gifts, or the family trips, but I remember finding a small tissue folded into a heart in my coat pocket every morning before school. Some days I noticed, some days I didn't, but Lila never forgot. My sister's not good with words. Her sentences can be jumbled, and her voice is uneven, but not once has she ever made me feel alone. And then on the very first afternoon I brought Alex home, Lila was the first to speak. With a bright smile and a voice so soft it felt like it brushed right against the mind. "Lily smiles more. Alex, good." I didn't say anything back. I just looked at her, because in that moment I knew no one understood me better than Lila. No one else could notice my happiness with such quiet precision. And now, as the car turned down the familiar street, one thing was clearer than ever. If I don't speak up for her, no one else will. We drove home in a long, heavy silence. The air inside the car felt thick, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness that slowly spread through each breath. Hard to name, but impossible to ignore. As soon as we pulled up to our house, Alex stepped out gently. I followed, opening the front door out of habit. But the way it swung open felt like it was letting in every buried thought I hadn't dared to say out loud. Just a few seconds after I stepped inside, Alex came over to me before I could even take off my shoes. Without a word, he wrapped his arms tightly around me. In that familiar hallway, he held me as if letting go might finally cause something inside me to break. With a whisper soft against my ear, he said, "I know how you feel. I know you're stuck between duty and love, but Lila has stayed quiet her whole life to keep everyone else comfortable. If you stay quiet too, who will stand for her?" Those words made me shiver. Not from cold, but because each hit my most fragile part, the part that had grown far too used to staying silent in the name of peace. Still held in his arms, I looked toward the living room. A large framed photo hung on the wall, one taken years ago at some formal family event. I was on the left, dressed sharply in a gown. Lila was off to one side, almost pushed out of frame, her quiet smile barely seen, her eyes not looking at anyone. The whole photo seemed to say what no one ever did out loud. She was never truly part of that space. And in the center of that image was the woman, straight-backed, sharp-eyed, one hand resting gently on her knee, like she could control the entire scene with just her presence. As my gaze stopped on her, my heart paused for a beat, not because of memories, but in that still-framed stare, I realized that maybe I wasn't completely alone. A few minutes later, Alex slowly let go. He didn't say anything more. He just briefly placed his hand on my chest, then turned and headed into the bedroom, leaving me with my thoughts. I sat on the living room chair, still locked on that photograph. Old memories rushed in quietly, uninvited, and in just those few minutes, one thought became crystal clear. I won't let my sister be cast aside ever again. The next morning, as sunlight spilled over the small garden behind our house, I stood by the glass door with a steaming cup of coffee. The white chrysanthemums I had planted for Alex were starting to bud. He liked things that bloomed slowly, releasing their fragrance quietly. And maybe, just maybe, that's why he understood Lila so well. About 5 minutes later, I pulled out my phone and dialed my father's number. After 3 rings, he picked up with a calm, steady voice. I said it clearly. I've made my decision. I'm having Lila stand beside me. Not a second passed before I heard a click. The line shifted and my mother's voice came through, sharp and cutting straight through my ear. "Have you forgotten what she did?" Before I could even respond, my father cut in. His voice wasn't raised, but it was firm, the kind of voice that had been waiting for this moment. "You want to bring that back? You want your parents humiliated again, Lily?" They hung up right after that. I knew they were furious. I stood still momentarily, then sat down in the chair by the window. My head felt heavy, and then, as if triggered by something I couldn't control, the old memories began to rise. Back then, Lila and I were still in elementary school. Lila accidentally bumped into my mother near the stairs at a cousin's birthday party. She fell, a simple misstep, but it ended with a broken arm. I remember it vividly. My father, Brandon, spent the next 2 days on the phone, nonstop, calling every connection he had in the political world. He needed to kill the story before it reached the local papers. And from that day on, Lila was never allowed at another family gathering again, not because anyone hated her, but because my parents didn't want to take another risk. The second incident happened 3 years later. My mother, Aurora, had just been honored as Mother of the Year at a major nonprofit event. She didn't let Lila attend, but that day Lila followed her anyway. Lila ran up on stage in the middle of the ceremony as her name was announced, and people began rising with applause. She wrapped her arms around our mom in front of the entire crowd. The clapping stopped within seconds. A photo was taken. Then it spread. A major donor pulled their support from my mother's organization. 1 week later, the press whispered. My mother couldn't sleep, and Lila was locked in her room for 3 straight days. Door shut, no one went near her. I remember because I was the one who left a folded paper cat at her door, then walked away before anyone could see. After that quick surge of memory, I opened my eyes, lifting my head from the silence. No one could deny that those things happened, not even me. But now, looking back on it all, one truth is more evident than ever. No one deserves to be ashamed of a child's mistakes. And that moment right then was only the beginning of a confrontation I could no longer avoid. After that short phone call, I knew I had just officially gone up against the people who gave me life and raised me. Since I was little, I understood that I wasn't just a daughter in this family. I was the one who had been chosen to represent, replace, and carry the image and success Lila would never be allowed to have. My parents never said it out loud, but every look and expectation carried the same message. I had to succeed because my sister couldn't. All through my growing years, if there was ever something that made me feel like my life had value, it was Lila's quiet presence. She never demanded anything, never compared. Every opportunity I was given came at the cost of her stepping back, and I knew the price she paid for that was nearly 30 years of silence. Lila and I are identical twins. Same DNA, same birth hour, shared breath inside the womb. When we were little, you couldn't tell us apart. But after one moment, one event, only one of us slowly faded from the world. We were 4 when our parents attended a major fundraising gala. I was brought on stage with Mom. Lila was sent to a separate childcare room in the back, a space that was too bright, too loud, with no one familiar to hold on to. I don't remember every detail of that day, but there's one image that's never left me. Even after all these years, it lives in me as vividly as the moment it happened. Lila pressed against the glass window, gripping the frame, blinking rapidly like she was trying to find something familiar. I looked back at her, but then, because Mom had told me not to leave the stage, I turned away and kept walking. By the end of the event, they found Lila curled up in a corner of that room. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, eyes on the floor. And from that day on, something inside her stopped reaching out. Years later, when I got older, I read everything I could about autism spectrum disorder. I learned about genetics, brain development, and how sometimes one single moment, one overwhelming experience, can interrupt the delicate rhythm of a child's growth. But the part that haunts me didn't come from any textbook. It's the question I've never been able to answer. If I had been the more fragile one, if I had been left alone in that room instead of her, would I have been the one kept hidden at home for the next 30 years? And if the answer is maybe, then that means she carried all that fragility for me. I used to think my parents would understand if I ever grew strong enough to face the truth. They'd finally see I wasn't the obedient child unthinkingly following the path they carved out. But I was wrong. In that moment, I felt it deep in my gut. What I was about to do wouldn't be met with understanding. It would be met with a crackdown. One they had been preparing for a very long time. And just as I'd expected, Brandon and Aurora showed up at my house that very evening. And this time, they weren't there for a conversation. The moment they walked in, they launched into what they believed was reason, about reputation, consequences, and public perception. Every word was wrapped in the calm tone of people who had long mastered the art of control without ever needing to raise their voice. But through all their arguments, every carefully worded point, not once did they refer to Lila as part of this family, not as a daughter, and certainly not as a sister. Then my father said something I still remember, word for word. "We've kept her hidden for nearly 30 years. You want to destroy this family's name?" It felt like someone had slammed a door shut right before me, not because I was shocked, but because he confirmed it so casually, like he was talking about a debt that had already been paid off. The house fell into a heavy, loaded silence when my father finished his sentence. But just seconds later, a voice cut through from the kitchen, sharp as steel, cold and echoing like it had sliced straight through the thick air. "What the hell did you just say, Brandon?" I turned. Stepping out from the shadows was my grandmother, Natalie Chambers. She lives alone in Prescott. She's 78 now, but her gaze has never dulled. She ran the entire Chambers family real estate empire for nearly 5 decades. She never made headlines, never gave speeches, but everything we have, every ounce of status, every piece of the fortune, passed through her hands. She had arrived nearly an hour earlier, long before my parents showed up. She hadn't said a word and had stood behind the kitchen door, quietly listening, like a judge waiting to hear every argument before delivering her verdict. And now she had chosen her moment. One sentence from her, just one, made my mother stumble back a step. My father froze, his lips twitching slightly. Then he stammered, "Mom, what are you doing here?" After my father asked that question, my mind returned to the phone call the night before. I called her, my grandmother, when everything became too much to carry. I told her everything about the wedding, Lila, and the cold rejection my parents had thrown in my face. After a long silence, she said only one sentence. If your sister agrees, then let her do it. And if anyone tries to stop her, I'll take care of it. She didn't ask who was right or wrong. She didn't need to know what led up to it. To her, family wasn't something you sculpt for appearances. It wasn't a place where someone could be cut out just for not fitting the mold. When I hung up that night, I knew I wasn't alone. I exhaled like I'd finally found something solid to hold on to in the middle of a storm. And just a few hours later, I called my parents. Now, standing in the living room, watching her step out from the kitchen shadows, I felt one thing with absolute clarity. Things were shifting. And I wasn't the only one fighting for Lila anymore. A few seconds after my father's question, Grandma stopped in the center of the living room, her eyes locked on Brandon. In a voice low but ringing, she repeated, "You think you have the right to make your daughter do that, Brandon?" There was a flicker of panic in his eyes as he replied, barely above a whisper. She dared to defy me." Grandma narrowed her eyes as if she couldn't believe what she just heard. Then her voice cracked through the room, sharp, bitter, and final, like a sentence handed down in court. "You hid your daughter like a stain, and now you stand here bragging about being a father?" Brandon didn't respond. He looked away, tugging slightly at the cuff of his sleeve, as if trying to salvage the last scraps of his dignity. But Grandma wasn't letting him hide. Without another word, she lifted the cane she had been leaning on and stepped toward him. He backed up instinctively, but she kept moving, not fast, not furious, just steady. Each tap of her cane felt like a sentence unspoken, but deeply understood. As he reached the table's edge, she lifted the cane and struck lightly across his shin. He flinched, stumbled back, and nearly fell. He fumbled to move away, but she followed. Not to hit, not to punish, but to remind him. In front of her, he was still the same boy who stole money from her purse at 13. Then, with eyes that didn't waver and a voice that cut like steel, she looked straight at him and said, "You think this is how you treat your child, Brandon?" My father didn't answer. For the first time in my life, I watched a man like him, so composed, so proud, shrink back, fold in, stripped of all his force. Not because he was hurt, but because he knew deep down he had already lost. Aurora stood frozen in place, her hands tightly clenched. Alex said nothing, but his hand closed firmly around mine, grounding me in that emotional earthquake. And I stood there, watching the scene that felt like something out of a chaotic dream. Yet it was the one moment that made me believe maybe justice was finally finding its voice. As Brandon staggered back, barely dodging the cane, Grandma stopped. She didn't chase. She didn't yell. She just stood tall, looked around the entire room, and declared in a voice so firm no one dared interrupt. "If anyone tries to keep Lila from being there, I'll strike their name from the will." The room fell into absolute silence. Brandon said nothing. The man who once stood behind podiums in state chambers, who had led countless PR campaigns, could do nothing now but take one step back. Not because he was hurt, but because he was afraid. Because Natalie Chambers had never let anyone stand past her without proving that they deserved to. A woman who had built an empire from nothing, who had held the entire family fortune steady through the most chaotic years. After my grandfather died suddenly, and my father was still just 17. A woman who forced my father to finish law school before she ever let him set foot in the family business. A woman who never sat in the seat of power because she didn't need to. Her word was always the last one spoken. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. She was still the one holding the wheel of this family. Not through wealth, not through position, but through a kind of moral authority that none of us dared forget. But what I didn't expect, what I couldn't have known, was that her arrival, it was only the beginning of the real earthquake to come. After that final strike of the cane, the air in my living room turned thick, like it had weight. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Only the sound of my father's shaky breathing echoed through the space. A room that had never witnessed anything so far beyond anyone's control. A few seconds later, my grandmother stepped back and sat in the nearest chair, one hand resting firmly on her cane. She sat with a stillness so solid, it was as if every breath she took was governed by pure will. Brandon stood behind her, not for protection, but like a child who'd just been caught, waiting for the final verdict. The difference between someone who once held power and someone who had never let go of it had never been more apparent. In that moment, I stood frozen, feeling something race down my spine. Not fear, but awe. For the first time, I saw my grandmother truly angry. Not loud, not chaotic, just controlled, focused, built over decades, and now finally just beginning to show. Aurora stood off to the side, her head lowered, eyes avoiding everyone. Her hands clutched each other tightly like she was holding on to the last shreds of pride she still had. When the tension in the room finally settled, Grandma swept her gaze across us all, then turned to my parents. Her voice was hoarse but firm, every word deliberate, with no room for evasion. Family is for protecting each other, not deciding who deserves to be seen. Do you two understand that now? Her words dropped into the room like a final judgment that needed no jury. I nodded without hesitation. Alex leaned into my shoulder, his body trembling slightly. Not out of fear, but because he knew we weren't alone. After that, nothing else needed to be said. Everything was crystal clear. And then my grandmother lifted her head and looked straight at the two people who once believed they controlled everything. Her eyes showed no mercy. And then she said, "If either of you tries to control Lily again, or hide Lila one more time, I'll erase you from the Chambers bloodline." There was no threat in her voice. It was a command, not because she held the will, but because everyone knew. If she said it, it had already been done, long before they could even think of resisting. For the first time, I felt something that couldn't be taken away, the right to protect Lila as an essential part of this family. And we weren't alone anymore. But somewhere deep inside, I still felt a faint unease. Everything had been said, but the wounds wouldn't vanish overnight. And I knew there were still rough roads ahead, ones we'd have to walk together if we wanted to hold on to fully what my grandmother stood up for that day. After that night, my parents left the house in silence after my grandmother's final words. There was no more anger in their eyes. No arguments left to give. Just a look, the kind that for the first time couldn't hold on to the pride they always carried. They walked out like people who had just lost control of a place they once believed they owned. Alex quietly stepped out the next morning, leaving the house to me and my grandmother. I sat down next to her, the woman I used to call the keeper of secrets when I was a kid. I looked at her for a few seconds, then asked, my voice steady and low, "Weren't you afraid Dad would push back?" When I finished, she tilted slightly and looked out the window. A long silence passed. Then, in a calm, even tone, she said, "I know how your father is. He's lived for duty since he was young. He earned everything he has today, aside from what I passed on, by carrying that weight alone. He didn't get to enjoy things the way other kids did. Your grandfather was strict. He loved hard, but never showed it. So your father, he grew up afraid to lose what he sacrificed his childhood to protect." Her words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Not sympathy, not anger, just a quiet ache. Because for the first time, I saw my father, the man who always seemed in control, as someone who had never been allowed to be vulnerable. I sat silently for a moment, then asked, softer this time, "What about my mom?" She didn't turn to face me. She just gave a faint nod and replied, voice still calm, "Your mother's not a bad person. She's like your father, too afraid of what people might say, too attached to appearances. But it's not that she doesn't love you girls. She just never learned how to show it." She paused, then turned to me. Her eyes were tired, full of sadness, but held no bitterness. "Since I moved to Cottonwood, I let them handle things in this house. I thought, the kids are grown. They'll know how to care for both of you. But I never expected they'd hide Lila away like something to be ashamed of, like she'd never existed if they didn't mention her name." Hearing that, something inside me sank. Her voice slowed, but every word landed with clarity. "In this family, if you're blood, you have a place. No one has the right to bury someone they love just because they're scared of losing face." At that moment, I reached over and took her hand, which was bony and colder than I had expected. I thought I'd cry, but the feeling inside wasn't pain anymore. It was something deeper, a gratitude so profound I couldn't put it into words. Because in a world built on image and pressure, someone had finally stood up to protect the child whose blood had been pushed aside. And I knew that many eyes would turn toward Lila on the day of the wedding, but this time, no one would look away. From that day on, everything in my family shifted. Not through a grand confrontation, not through some formal reconciliation, but through the quiet, unwavering presence of my grandmother, Natalie Chambers. She temporarily moved in with my parents until the wedding was over. My father said nothing. My mother nodded. One by one, they stepped back, as if her presence alone had made every argument feel pointless. And I knew her return to that house wasn't just a choice. It was a silent force that compelled everyone to look at themselves differently. During that time, Lila started calling me often. Each call felt like its own little world, filled with excitement, curiosity, and tiny questions that held more emotion than most people could imagine. Things she had never been allowed to express before. One morning, just after I left the clinic, my phone rang. Lila's voice came through, a little choppy, but clear. Mom and Dad said, "Lila can go. Go wedding. Lily wedding. Lila goes." While double-checking the guest list that afternoon, my screen lit up again. A video call. This time, Lila's face was pressed close to the camera, her voice full of enthusiasm, like a kid being dressed for her first big show. "Lily, this shirt okay? Blue shirt or black shirt with buttons or no buttons?" Every time I'd glance at Alex, we'd smile, sometimes even chuckle. Not because what she said was funny, but because I knew, without a doubt, Lila was happy. Really, genuinely happy. And for me, that alone made everything worth it. Looking back, I'm deeply grateful to my grandmother. Not in the loud, over-celebrated kind of way, but in the quiet, whole way. The kind that settles into your bones. Because without her, I'm not sure my wedding could have unfolded as I'd hoped. Not with the wholeness, not with the joy, not with everyone being seen, no one left out. And now, as the day draws closer, minute by minute, I've started to realize something. Sometimes what makes your heart race isn't fear that something might go wrong. It's the quiet disbelief that something this good could finally be yours. 1 month after that dinner, Alex and I were officially married at Desert Foothills, a serene, private venue in the heart of Scottsdale, Arizona. It could hold 300 guests, just the right size to feel intimate and meaningful. And the most important thing to me that day was that Lila stood beside me. She wasn't anxious. She wasn't confused. She just smiled gently, took my hand, and whispered, relaying instructions from her coach through a video call earlier. "Lily, is this the right spot? Wind a little strong, but I'm wearing the suit now. I'm talking already, like you said. I did it." I nodded. She leaned slightly to the side, adjusting the lapel of her navy suit, the one she had chosen after 4 rounds of video calls the week before the wedding. As the rows of seats filled in, my parents arrived. Brandon wore a gray suit, quiet and reserved, speaking to no one. Aurora followed behind, dressed in a floor-length gown, her expression tense. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, almost as if to keep herself from trembling. My grandmother sat in the front row. Her silver hair was tied neatly in a bun, and she held her familiar cane. But today, something was different. She wore my grandfather's pearl pin. I knew exactly what that meant. She was making sure he was present, too. When Lila stepped out to stand beside me, the room shifted, just for a second. Some guests glanced at each other. A few exchanged uncertain looks. One person tilted their head. Someone else clapped hesitantly. Their eyes weren't cruel, but they held that quiet, uncomfortable pause people often give to someone different, unsure whether to offer kindness or keep their distance. A middle-aged woman leaned in and whispered something to her husband. A man gently pulled his child a little closer to his side. Others looked away. And I knew, if I didn't break that silence now, this entire ceremony would slip into something far too familiar. A setting where Lila would once again be quietly pushed to the background, as if her presence didn't belong under the light. Right before the ceremony began, as the music started to play, I stepped up to the platform and adjusted the microphone. Then I looked out across the room and said clearly, "Before anything begins, before Alex walks down that aisle, I'd like to say a few words." The hall fell utterly silent. I took a deep breath, placed my hand gently on Lila's shoulder, and continued. "The woman standing beside me is my sister. Her name is Lila Chambers. We were born on the same day, same year, same hour. But she hasn't been present at many critical moments for reasons beyond her control. Today, I'm not only marrying the man I love, but standing beside the person I've waited my whole life to see recognized. She doesn't need to explain herself. She doesn't need your acceptance, your approval, or your understanding. Because her presence is the thing I'm most proud of in this life." Silence swept through the room as I finished speaking. Then I saw eyes meeting across rows. A few heads nodded. Some guests quietly wiped away tears. Brandon stood at the back staring at Lila. He didn't say a word, but he didn't look away either. Aurora stepped forward. She moved slowly toward Lila, then bowed her head slightly. She didn't speak, but she looked her in the eye for the first time in decades. From the front row, I heard a quiet sob. My grandmother was crying. She didn't reach for a tissue. She placed her hand over her chest and stayed still, as if every word that needed to be said had already been spoken that day in my living room. And now all that remained was this, a quiet kind of happiness. Not perfection, but connection. When I placed the ring on Alex's finger, he smiled through tears. He didn't say a word, just squeezed my hand and exhaled slowly. There was nothing loud, no grand declarations, just presence and acceptance. And in the moment I looked over at Lila, still standing there, smiling softly, she leaned toward me and whispered, "We did it, right? We did it." And in that instant, I knew there would never be a wedding more perfect than this one. And today, exactly 1 year after that fateful dinner, I'm sitting alone on the balcony of the house Alex and I have lived in since before the wedding. This house has witnessed tense family gatherings, long, sleepless nights of doubt, and the quiet moment when Lila first sat calmly at the kitchen counter, patiently dipping cookies into milk. A year has passed, bringing with it so many changes. Not loud, dramatic ones, but quiet, steady, lasting ones. After the wedding, our family was briefly mentioned in a few media outlets, stories analyzing Lila's presence at the ceremony, but those pieces faded. People stopped asking. The conversations fell away, almost as if understanding had settled in. And the most critical part? Lila is still here. She's seen, she's invited, she's accepted. My father, a man who once believed reputation was untouchable, now sends me photos. In them, Lila is building model kits or learning to use a tablet. She doesn't write anything with them, but I understand. He's learning how to see his daughter, truly see her, with different eyes. My mother has started sending recipes, little notes in neat handwriting, saying things like, "Lila used to love this, not spicy, chop the onions small." My grandmother has returned to Cottonwood and is back to her routine, but every week she video calls all of us, me, Alex, and Lila. The calls are short, a few questions, sometimes just enough time to hear Lila talk about whatever animated movie she's watched that week. And she always smiles and asks, "Do your friends at the center still tell those silly jokes?" Lila hasn't changed much. She still moves at her own pace, still asks questions out of the blue, still lights up when someone listens to her all the way through. But now she's part of everything. She's in the plans, she's in the room, she's counted in, entirely and without question. Our little family is beginning to take shape. A husband who understands, a sister who is present. And soon a new life would follow, growing quietly inside me. Last week, while we were organizing baby things, Alex turned to me and asked, "If it's a boy, what should we name him?" I didn't answer right away. I thought of Lila at 4 years old, standing behind the glass door. I thought of her holding my hand at the altar, her face glowing with pride and peace. And I said, "Elliot." Alex nodded. He didn't need to ask why. I know a name won't erase what Lila went through, but it's my way of telling the world. My sister was once ignored. My child will not be. And if there's one thing I want to leave you with from everything I've shared, it's this. Everyone deserves to be fully seen. No one should live in the shadow of someone else's fear. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone you love is stand in a crowded room, point to them, and say, "I choose that one." Because all it takes is one person brave enough to do that, and an entire family can begin again. With acknowledgement, with unconditional love, and with a promise. From now on, no one gets left behind. That's where my story ends. And before I close this chapter, I want to ask you, the kind souls who've stayed with me through every moment of this journey, was I wrong to stand beside the one my family once tried to hide? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched something in you, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe and join me on my journeys. Thank you, sincerely, for being here.